Good afternoon. Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, August 19th, 2020. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. We'll be joined today by Tom Hazlett, who is a researcher, scholar, economist, and all-around expert on all things telecom. He will be with us and will be continuing our discussion, Champions of Broadband, in which we have interviews and discussions with individuals who have devoted their careers to getting higher capacity broadband and better lives as a result of that better broadband. I just wanted to take a minute before we get started on our discussion with Professor Hazlett to talk a little bit about some of the activities Broadband Breakfast has been doing over the summer. In addition to this Broadband Breakfast Live Online event that we've hosted consistently since the start of the pandemic, we've been having really excellent coverage thanks to our reporters and editors on Broadband Breakfast. Right now, we're covering the Democratic National Convention with a particular reference to politics of technology, and we just concluded a week and 2 days ago our digital infrastructure investment event. That will be rebroadcast during Broadband Communities, the virtual summit that will take place on September 22nd, 23rd, and 24th. I am also wanting to mention some of the great reporting that we've had on the site about different broadband networks. We've had coverage of deployments, including Utopia Fiber, including Sci-Fi Networks, including Danville, Virginia, and look soon to a article about Los Altos Hills Fiber and the activities going on there. I'm now going to turn to our guest, Tom Hazlett. Thank you so much for joining me, Professor Hazlett. Tom, this is like our fourth or fifth, I guess, depending on how you count them, of our series, Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We've been interviewing people who have been in the trenches for many years in their careers talking about broadband. And I'm really pleased that Professor Hazlett is able to join us. I've had a great privilege of working with him for many years. I thought we would just start off by saying a few words about your latest book, The Political Spectrum, and maybe a little bit about yourself as well. I guess I should say, and this is on the site, so you've probably seen this already, but Professor Hazlett is the professor. I guess you got a special chair named after you here. It's called the H.H. Macaulay Endowed Chair of Economics at Clemson University. And of course, Professor Hazlett's specialty is the field of law and economics as it applies to the information economy. So tell us a little bit about how you got interested in this field, maybe as a prelude to kind of talking about the political spectrum, this work you've been doing for many years.
Well, thank you, Drew, and thank you. It's a great honor to be in your series, and in fact, it's a privilege to have known you for a while, and to see how your contributions are making a difference in the world. And so, my hat's off to you. And hopefully, I'll add a little microcosm, microscopic bit of knowledge here. Anyway, so I'm an economist, and I came out to thinking about specifically cable TV franchising. In fact, when I wrote a dissertation at UCLA in the 1980s, I was hoping to investigate something having to do with old style public utility regulation, but the sort of the newfangled regulation was occurring with cable TV franchises. And I went to some franchise hearings in Los Angeles and Scottsdale, Arizona, and some places that were still being licensed even in the early to mid 80s, and wrote a dissertation that had a lot to do with that, and started publishing some in that area, and got quite interested in the regulation of that sector. Now, in those days, by the way, cable was called broadband, and telephone lines were narrowband. And so the idea of having more capacity in a line has been a distinction for of course quite some decades, if not generations. From a technical standpoint, cable systems, of course, arose to satisfy a particular market that was a bit different than voice. Voice didn't have the so-called bandwidth requirements at the time, and so over the last few years, the last 3 decades, 3 to 4, we've actually seen the convergence, of course, of those markets, and the addition of terrestrial wireless come in to actually compete. So we don't even think about narrowband versus broadband in the sense of voice versus data. They're flowing over the same network infrastructures. So looking at cable TV franchising and some of the regulatory issues there, we got into issues of rate regulation. Of course, there were deregulatory acts in 1984 at a federal level. There are also state regulations and deregulations happening for some years during that period. And then in 1992, the rate re-regulation came in with an act of Congress, the only legislation overturned during the George Herbert Walker Bush administration was in fact the 1992 Cable Act, and Republicans and Democrats overrode his veto. So that was a very lively issue, and I published a book just a few years later on cable rate regulation. And, franchising regulation all in there together, quite fascinating. But then the emergence of competition between cable and telephony, and of course, the explosion of new demands triggered by commercialization of the internet, 1992, 93, 94. That period was rather tumultuous. We look back on it now, and we even see more of the historic nature of what was evolving there. So today, to update to 2020, when you and I are talking on a broadband connection, and it's a pro forma that people are telecommuting, as the old term was, and conducting commerce and education and connecting through broadband networks. That has evolved through basically an unleashing, a liberalization of what networks are allowed to do, and with wireless, the amount of radio spectrum put into the marketplace to allow competitive enterprise and, in fact, creative destruction. So,
Professor, so let me jump in for a quick second. So I appreciate you kind of starting with the cable, right? And sometimes in the world of FCC watchers and broadband geeks, we maybe make this distinction, artificial as it is, between wireline and wireless, right? And so you're basically saying, hey, you originally got into this field through cable and cable franchising and so forth, but you've obviously done quite a bit of work in this area, as many areas. I wanted to kind of say, well, now, what prompted your thinking and your investigation into the wireless space, which, as I understand it, is what you really have focused on most recently in the political spectrum? And obviously, you've got some great stories about the origins of the Federal Radio Commission, the Federal Communications Commission. Tell us a little bit about the sanity or lack of sanity in thinking about the world in terms of wired versus wireless, and maybe dial us back to the 1920s and Herbert Hoover's role in what was then, to some people, the chaos of the airwaves.
Sure. So thanks. As usual, you're paying attention and very politely not noting that I didn't actually, in my long answer, get to your question, which was about my recent book, The Political Spectrum: The Tumultuous Liberation of Wireless Technologies from Herbert Hoover to the Smartphone. And so it's sort of a curious and typical story, I guess, in academia, where I came out studying cable TV in particular, and I was seeing how telephone, cable were competing. But I got an assignment actually from a foreign publisher to write a chapter for an upcoming book on broadcasting in the United States. And this was, I think, 1988. But at any rate, I believe I wrote a chapter for that book that was never published. But just in having that assignment and turning my attention to the historical origins of regulation in wireless in the United States, particularly, and then trying to see how that had played out through some decades, it dawned on me that the interpretation of how we came up with a regulatory structure had very little to do with the conventional wisdom about how there was chaos in the airwaves and the old notions of property rights didn't work. This had been an explanation that had been not only advanced by regulators and some proponents of broadcast licensing for political purposes. They were quite outspoken about how important that was. It was also taken as sort of the state of the art by Ronald Coase and economists who were quite sophisticated in their economic analysis. And Coase later going on to win a Nobel Prize, largely for what he wrote about, starting with radio spectrum and how it was regulated. So at any rate, it was interesting to me to find out that, in fact, the origins of regulation had a lot to do with interest group competition and various actors trying to gain through what political scientists call a rent-seeking process, trying to gain sort of special inside position in a licensed system. And in fact, the idea of having ownership or decentralized coordination of radio spectrum applications, wireless, that had been part of the equation from the beginning, but it had some to its credit, had some very pro-competitive and innovative aspects. But the initial radio stations that were licensed in the 1920s, along with some political interests that wanted more regulatory oversight, Herbert Hoover and people who were pushing for a licensing system were quite explicit that it was very important for the political system and for electoral processes to have free speech modified and regulated in a way that was inherently hostile to the First Amendment. But they were sort of steered in a different direction about the technical aspects of broadcasting, which do not hold up. They don't hold up scientifically as technical matter. They don't hold up economically as a matter of scarcity being solved in many markets by price competition and auctions. And so going back to the origins, you see that there actually is a very rational story for why people are pursuing different sets of rules for wireless than they do in other markets, whether it be agricultural regulation or farm land ownership or newspaper regulation for that matter.
And by different sets of rules, you mean the rent seeking that we have because of the FCC's creation?
Well, the 1927 Radio Act, which was the brainchild essentially of Herbert Hoover, and of course came out of Congress, a battle between the House and the Senate, and it did get to Calvin Coolidge, and this worked its way. It took several years, and Coolidge signs the Act 1927. So this is all under Republican rule, but the public interest standard is enacted that the regulators get a chance to allocate spectrum, which does not mean that they're just defining the rights to spectrum and then selling off the rights. They are defining how radio waves can be used, for what services, with what technologies, which parties are allowed to have access to these airwaves and what parties may not. In the 1927 Act, they put in a ban on foreign ownership, which has nothing to do, of course, with radio interference, which was the premise of the act, that there would be, as you mentioned before, chaos if you actually had free market competition and markets try to allocate radio wave rights. But this was a very political act, and the way it played out with the public interest standard was that commissioners in a political body would make determinations, and suppose you had low valued spectrum being set aside for one purpose, that there were no rights in the market where an owner could say, hey, wait a minute, I'm doing very little with this spectrum. I can do 10 times as much if I figure out how to apply a new technology or sell to some developer of the new technology. And so you don't have those competitive flows
Yeah, let me stop you there, Tom, and ask. Okay, so both for younger viewers who may not be familiar with the fact that, hey, auctions are a commonplace now. People talk about auctions. There's auctions going on pretty much all the time. Right now, there's an auction for Citizens Band broadband service, right? Citizens Broadband Radio Service, CBRS. There's other auctions, and that's now kind of a commonplace. But on the other hand, people may go, wait a second, what are you saying, Tom? Are you saying that we could not have any Federal Radio Commission or Federal Communications Commission, and there still would be order in the airwaves? Will you kind of address this notion of property rights? What does it mean to have a property right in an airwave? Could that work? Did it work? And how will we get back to that kind of system?
Right. Yeah. So the historical tweak on this is that in actuality, what happened in the U.S. is not shocking when you really think about it. Radio waves were not known to be a valuable asset, and there was no problem with allocating radio waves prior to 1895, when Marconi figures out how to send radio communications through space. And in fact, even at that moment, when there's only 2 radios in existence in the world, really there's no scarcity issue. There's no interference or conflict. And things kind of went in that direction pretty smoothly until about 1920. And then you have an innovation in the marketplace. And what happens is that a radio station, KDKA in Pittsburgh, actually figures out a business model. Just send out broadcasts with entertainment, with content, and try to get people to buy radios. And the station, KDKA, was owned by Westinghouse, and they wanted to sell radios. Well, this idea actually caught on, not just for radio set manufacturers, but for a lot of companies that saw, or even other institutions, city governments, trade unions, nonprofit organizations, universities. Anyway, this caught on. So within 2 years, there were 500 radio stations broadcasting, sending out in all directions high-powered signals. Now you actually had some question about who owned what and where the conflicts were and how they could be resolved in a reasonable way. So the immediate response of regulators through the Department of Commerce, where there was a 1912 law that actually gave authority to the Department of Commerce to actually settle such disputes, they adopted from common law priority in use. If you had been broadcasting and had developed something that was useful to the public, you have first in time rights. It's a very common principle you find in legal systems and property rights in the U.S. and many other countries. At any rate, that actually governed with the help of the Department of Commerce, but that was the way that the actual AM radio broadcasting market develops, and millions of radio sets are sold. There is not endemic chaos. This is why people are buying radio sets. And 1924 is Radio Christmas. It's really the hit, the killer app of the 1920s, and the first real mass market, individual household electronic communications that was instantaneous like this. Now, telephones were also developing in a wireline setting, and you also, of course, had telegraph some years before this. But this was the one-to-many broadcast where, of course, politicians or sports events, you could have communications to millions of people simultaneously and instantaneously. So this is really quite life-changing for society, and people know it, and this is happening. But there's this political problem, and in fact, many incumbent radio stations that got established at that time wanted quite explicitly and logically, they wanted to limit entry into the market, and so did a lot of other political interests that thought that really good citizenship would rely on a regulated system. And Herbert Hoover, who was a very technically oriented engineer, a very successful engineer, he sort of led this movement and coordinated with the industry, the radio industry. And by 1927, they had the support to get this law passed that said that there would be no private ownership of the radio waves. That's the first sentence in the Radio Act of 1927. It says that you cannot assert vested rights in channels.
So is this socialism? Is this like Herbert Hoover's socialist tendencies, or I mean, how do you characterize what he did, and have we gotten away from that through this eventual process of thinking about spectrum differently that Ronald Coase and yourself and others have helped gear us toward?
Yeah, I wouldn't call Hoover a socialist, and in fact I probably wouldn't call him a progressive. But the progressive ideas were around, and certainly Hoover was very much in favor of public-private coordination, and he wanted big business to get together with government regulators and basically figure out how these airwaves should be regulated in the public interest. And he did not want them to go out to free market. He wanted there to be content controls, and immediately you can see under the 1927 Radio Act, which creates the Radio Commission, that there is a fairness doctrine that pops in. They don't call it that, but by 1929, they're delaying or denying renewals of radio licenses to socialist organizations. And radio stations were said to engage in propaganda, that the idea of the use of the radio waves was supposed to be for the public and for everyone, and to have general interest programs, not to have your own viewpoint. Well, there were stations at that time that were owned by trade unions like WCFL, Chicago Federation of Labor, or WEVD for the
Eugene V. Debs.
Debs, yeah. And in New Jersey, and thank you for your socialist history on that. But they had renewal problems because they were very explicitly, stations were founded for a point of view, and they ran into trouble under the public interest standard that was interpreted by the regulators, and to say that you had to basically have a watered down, very very non-political approach to things, and if you were controversial, you'd have trouble. And in fact, both stations were essentially driven from their political viewpoints by the problems they got from regulators under licensing. Mm-hmm. So that was how that developed. I mean, as I said, I wouldn't call it socialist. The ownership of the stations was still private enterprise, and it was a regulated system. You know, countries like England, you know, our peer countries, generally did not have private ownership of radio stations. So we were the capitalists on that, and it was seen that to have private companies competing to compete for audiences and to build stations and have their own programming, that was seen to be fairly effective. And it was the entertainment markets developed in the United States to become the envy of the world. But it was a system that did overturn private property rights in radio spectrum. There's no question. Now, when you say, can it work to have private ownership? Well, it has worked. Not only was it the first come, first served rules of the initial days, we have liberalized radio spectrum ownership very dramatically without calling it a revolution.
Right. How have the rules that have come in since the '93 Budget Act and really brought much broader use of auctions, and how do those differ from the first in use concept in terms of property rights ownership?
So yeah, it's a very political adaptation of the property rules. But by the way, the '93 Budget Act did bring in auctions of licenses, and that had been something that had been debated for decades. Ronald Coase in 1959, rather famously amongst economists, pushed this position very articulately and strongly, that there should be license auctions. There had been a University of Chicago student who wrote a note in the University of Chicago Law Review in 1951, Leo Herzl, who said the same thing. And in fact, Coase was provoked by that article. This is 70 years ago now. So these ideas have been around for a long time. And finally, they got into law, but the liberalization of property rights had started considerably before 1993. And what I mean by that is this. Under the 1927 Act, the radio license was required for any emissions into the electromagnetic spectrum. So you have a situation where regulators are now saying what spectrum can be utilized by which parties using what technologies, what business models. So a broadcast television license has to use a particular technology, has to be advertising supported, can't be a subscription service. It's located, the broadcaster, its antenna is located in one particular spot at one particular altitude with one particular power level. All this stuff is regulated. They can't go next door to another TV station, say, hey, what can we combine our spectrum, or can we use a different technology, do something differently? No, that is all decided by regulators. So what happens to get towards a more, and that is an administrative system. There's no question that the property rights are held by regulators. And if you have a good technology that's much better than what people are using today, you can't just go and deploy it in the market. You can't buy inputs and say, I want to buy some radio spectrum rights and just go do it. You have to ask the regulators, can I get a special allocation for my system? Okay, and to get that, you have to reveal what your technology is, what your business model is. You have to talk to all the people in Congress and the FCC and all this.
So what brought liberalization? When would you say liberalization began, if before 93?
Well, it worked politically. This was very popular in radio and television because radio and television are inherently political. And so the political authorities don't mind restricting television and radio stations to a few very prosperous companies that then will show the regulators that they're doing things that are in the public interest, like giving some time for political candidates or not giving that much time, not doing controversy, and so forth. And in fact, the political system really likes that. Now, when it got to the next generation, and finally that generation was stalled for decades, cellular took at least 30 years to work its way through the system because the technology comes out after World War II, and we don't actually get cellular systems till the 1980s. But when cellular finally gets to the market and it's ripe, it's not a political system. It's a common carrier service. You and I are talking on a telephone. That's not, that doesn't have a lot to do with political campaigns or support for campaigns. That's just individual private commerce and business and human relations being transacted. And it's very complicated. Broadcasting was simple for regulators to plan out. You get one broadcast transmitter in Pittsburgh, and here's the power level, and we have the technology. Right. That's it. Cellular is hundreds of thousands now of radio stations, base stations, and architectures. And people talk about 5G. That means since the 80s, we've had 5 complete generational changes. 5th generation now just since the 1980s. So television lasted for 50 years with one technology. From the 1930s to the 1990s, lasted more than that with basically the same broadcast technology.
Color TV, important innovation there.
Well, TV was great, certainly, and I don't, TV doesn't have to apologize for how successful it was in society. But I'm saying that just in terms of what the regulators wanted to regulate, it actually was very important and easy to regulate broadcasting. But and all countries of the world have regulated broadcasting to a very political, to a very great extent politically. So when it came to the cellular systems, when they got finally into the market or were about to get in the market, there was a lot of pressure now building to just let them go out and compete without this political control, because there wasn't a lot of interest in it politically, and it was too complicated. Okay, but I will say that just along the way, though, is still they tried, U.S. regulators tried to regulate cellular the same old ways they had, and it was really breaking. It was taking forever to get that stuff out. And finally, in the 1980s, when we finally started that proceeding in 1968, officially opened a cellular proceeding because the technology was ripe. I said it would have been since 1945.
Right.
The actual people at Bell Labs, the engineers, have been talking about doing this and had plans for these cellular systems, wireless phones. And finally, it gets to 68. The technology is ready to. It's not the same technology, of course, we have today, 50 years later, but it was ripe. So it took from 1968 to 1984 to actually get the first licenses out. The last ones came in 1989. Right. So in that whole period, the FCC, they're grappling with basically the old broadcast system for cellular. The first thing they decided was cellular had to be a monopoly. you could only have one company do it. And in fact, it had to be the company that was affiliated with the phone monopoly at the local level. So you had to have an AT&T affiliate, one per market. Well, they made that decision. A few years later, they said, well, wait a minute, why don't we try two? Let's get crazy. Let's try two. We'll do an AT&T company, and then we'll do a non-AT&T wireline company. And then they said, well, okay, we'll try that. May be crazy. We'll make sure that one gets built. That's what AT&T is going to do. They'll build it. But maybe this competitor can compete, and we can get a duopoly. So finally they did that, and they had all these questions about what standard to use. And finally, by 82, they squared it up, and they started getting serious. And by 84, we're actually giving out licenses for the top 30 U.S. markets. And by the 84 Olympics, we actually had cellular service in Los Angeles. That's how long it took.
So you've dived into some of the ways that liberalization came pre-auctions, pre the 93 Act and the development of auctions. And let's just remind ourselves, we started off with this view of broadcast, the original wireless, right, needed to be a monopoly, or needed to be not a monopoly, but needed to be heavily regulated by the government, and created this divergent view of speech where free speech did not apply in the electronic sphere as it did in the print media world, and different legal rules emanated from that. You've also talked about, okay, well, how do we get to an understanding of auctions and understanding of markets and the way they work? And then you've also talked about kind of the competition landscape with the cable TV playing a role here. So let me kind of push one more time in your particular role. You were the chief economist at the Federal Communications Commission. Could you refresh our memories on the years you were there, and what role did you see the FCC potentially playing in this liberalization effort through those activities, some of which you've been recounting here?
Yeah, well, this was a great opportunity that's afforded to academics who go to visit the commission for a year or two. And I went in 1991, 92, and was chief economist in the last part of the H.W. Bush administration, and Al Sykes was the able chairman of the FCC at that point. And the chief economist slot has been there ever since. My tenure there was sometimes referred to as the first chief economist slot, but there actually were in previous generations some chief economists. But anyway, this has been a modern innovation, and the chief economist is essentially a consultant to the commission, particularly the chairman, who learns a lot because they're coming in from the outside, but is supposed to also give some economic expertise in some of these decisions that are made. And at the time, there were no auctions. There had been requests all the way from the Carter administration to now the first Bush 41 administration to get auction authority. As you noted, it finally came then in 1993. So we were talking about auctions. We were talking about getting congressional authority to do them. We were doing lotteries. The FCC was at that point. They had been very embarrassing because you literally gave away tens of $billions in rents to lucky winners who were flipping the licenses, and that actually helped finally get auction authority because that was so embarrassing. By the way, the lotteries were better than the old comparative hearings because they went faster, and you didn't have to go through all these hearings. And the FCC in the 80s was giving out these cellular licenses, and they had to give out 1,400 of them because there were the two licenses in each of 734 local cellular franchise areas. And to actually have lawyers sit down and go through the public interest reasons, which they started to do. They did that for the top 30 markets, and it was ridiculous. The people with the paper that they were producing to show that their team was in the public interest they were shipping them in semi trucks. Everything had to be 5 copies at that time. It's early digital, and there was a warehouse in Pennsylvania that partially collapsed under the weight of this paper. And so it was a ridiculous process, and they went to lotteries. And the only thing more ridiculous than lotteries was the old comparative hearing thing. But it looked bad when, particularly in Cape Cod, became the poster child for this. There was some wealthy investors put in a ticket for the Cape Cod cellular franchise, and they got it, and they flipped it to a real telephone company, and they made I don't know, $30-40 million for a few weeks' work.
Yeah.
And so that became a cause celeb, and congressmen thought that was terrible and stupid, and the FCC said, yeah, well, let's go to auctions.
Let's auction. Well, let's get we have a questioner, Sean McLaughlin, who asks a number of questions. I'm going to let two of them here, and love your reactions here. So this point here, the public owns the spectrum, private interest buy licenses to lease the asset. And then he makes this point about decline of localism marked the demise of the social contract involving absentee ownership. So that's one question I want you to take together with this one here, which is maybe the future-oriented question. If that's the past-oriented question, here's the future-oriented one. Dynamic use of spectrum, use it or share it policies, unlicensed spectrum, and intelligent devices have changed the landscape. I'll throw one more in here by Sean. Thank you for your active question, Sean. Remember the Negroponte switch that predicted changes in our use of wireless and wireline telephones, wireless and wireline networks for fixed versus mobile use. And obviously you are familiar with that. So to tackle Sean's perspective here about, the public owns it, right? What do you think of that perspective? And on the other hand, what do you think of those who say, well, look, now we've gotten to the point where technology allows us to share this better. And so do we still need the private flexible use that you've done so much to champion, Tom?
Right. So, yeah, no, Sean gets it exactly right. A lot of the lawyers miss this. And even in FCC proceedings, you see it stated incorrectly. The official policy from the 1927 Radio Act it was not a nationalization. The government did not assert ownership of the spectrum. In fact, that came up in the debate over the 27 Act. The official position is that the public owns the spectrum, and the regulators are there to regulate and to provide for the best use of that spectrum. And so Sean then raised this point. Then why not have rules that mandate that the spectrum is well used and so forth for that public? Well, that's exactly what happened to the 1927 Act, and happened for many decades in broadcasting. And it was a chimera that, in fact, the public was being served. It was a very poor system relative to the alternatives. That is to say that political interests basically restricted the amount of speech there could be. Community interests were identified in a rent-seeking context that was really a process that was non-serious. As one FCC commissioner called the licensing under the public interest standard for TV and radio, it was like professional wrestling, full of grunts and groans signifying nothing. It was, we pretend to regulate them and they pretend to be regulated, but the basic concept and the way that system worked out is that there was a restriction of entry into the market, there were special favors then awarded, and then there were political transactions, both straightforward and open, for example, things like the fairness doctrine, and then other things that were much more political and sort of off the books. But even the equal time rule and the fairness doctrine, which are the most important content regulations that are part of this system, were failures in terms of promoting free speech. They tended to chill speech. You'll notice that we only got televised presidential debates when we, in essence, deregulated and eliminated, for all practical purposes, the equal time rule for presidential campaigns, because you just don't get it if you have all the presidential. You don't get any debates if you have 30 presidential candidates, which is exactly what the fairness doctrine, the equal time rule, which is in the 1927 Act, mandated. And so we got away from that finally in the by congressional enactment of alternative rules that superseded the 27 Act, and we now have a presidential debates commission that doesn't have to. It's not considered news, and it is considered news. It's not considered politics, right, or candidate discussion or something like that. So you can cut out the 30 odd other party candidates and have the major candidates debate. So that's just one of the perverse consequences of thinking that the government is going to do a good job of running this market. Now, it gets even worse when you look at the technical trade-offs. The government, of course, has very little idea about what the best new technologies are that haven't been invented yet. And we know from experience, not just in spectrum, but in many, many fields, that the superior way to do this is to not try to invest all the decision-making authority into some small clique that's politically appointed, but to open the market to competitive innovation. And so what happens is that when you have identifiable owners of radio spectrum, you can try different models. Now, Sean brings up unlicensed spectrum as though that has somehow changed our view on property rights. This argument's been made for quite a while, at least 20 years now, that it's been brought up that, with the rise of Wi-Fi and, some other applications that have done quite well running over and become quite popular running over unlicensed, that we don't need any identifiable rights to the spectrum. And that's just false. People in the market are willing to pay for some jurisdiction over the way the resource is used, because the investment makes a lot more sense. The investment at all ends of the ecosystem fits together if you have some ability to control exactly how the space is used. And of course, all spaces are used. There's nothing open access about unlicensed. It's unpriced in a certain way, in a certain dimension, but there are power limits, technology rules, and allocations made by regulators. And so that's why you don't have an obliteration of the value in licensed spaces with liberal rules. Right now we're up to $4 or $5 billion for the current auction. You don't have an elimination of value for the owned spaces or privatized spectrum rights just because you have a lot. We have thousands of megahertz of unlicensed out there now, and generally, by the way, the unlicensed work in as complements to owned spaces, just like the Wi-Fi I'm on right now, and you probably are as well. That works very well with your broadband network. The broadband network is generally operating on fixed lines where the spaces are owned by the broadband pipe owner, and you can do very well with a cordless PC on that, just like you did with a cordless phone. Okay, the last 30 feet or the last 300 feet, and it works well on the campus or the enterprise. And that's because there's not a lot of coordination that takes place there between different parties. You go across the country and try to build a whole network that way, that can be quite a different matter. Now, the trade-offs between localized control and nationwide networks is always changing, and those changes should be reflected in the technology and the architectures and the market structures. That's why it's so important not to simply distribute government-managed spectrum, which is unlicensed, on top of and instead of crowding out the licensed spaces. The licensed spaces in a competitive environment will allow competing ideas to actually be tested with consumers and technology innovators. And those are extremely important spaces. They're extremely important around the world. They are used to provide wireless phone service to 6 billion people on the planet today. And those services would not be provided, have not been provided nearly as well by a system that does not reflect those. And it's an amazing policy success that over the last 30 years, forget about the United States, where we had relatively good phone service to start with, but go to places all over the planet that had no telephone service. I'm talking about for 90% of the population, that we got up to a little over 1 billion telephones, fixed line, hardwired telephones, and we're actually going down now because they're being displaced by wireless. But we never got anywhere near universal coverage with the old systems that were run by state monopolies that had oodles of political momentum and subsidies and public interest behind them. We've gotten this enormous increase in communications through liberalization, allowing more competitive ideas to get in the market, compete head to head, and then figure out through discovery where our better pathway lies.
And of course, you're equating liberalization as and marketplace. The market has the opportunity to reflect its preferences, so you have licensed opportunities. And this is a great point. I think you've addressed these questions. I want to bring back to the Cable Act, right? The '92 Cable Act, and bring cable into this discussion because of the role that the cable industry played in terms of content, in terms of what could be displayed on cable versus what could be displayed on broadcast television, how it might have impacted the fairness doctrine, and also the point about competition, right? So some we've had Blair Levin on this show before, and he's always talking about the '92 Cable Act and the role it played in getting satellite to compete with cable. Kind of basically cable then realizing the only way they could compete with satellite was to build out broadband networks. So let's talk just a little bit about your take on the '92 Cable Act on both the content side and also the infrastructure side that's gotten America to this point where, at least for some years, we had this kind of telco versus cable push on broadband. And where do you see that heading right now? Has that run its course? And so kind of maybe kind of easing into the fixed wireless or wireline, segment of broadband deployment here, Tom.
Sure. Yeah. Well, no, I'm very happy that Blair pursues the argument that the '92 Act really fixed competition in cable and so forth. But because I participated in that, and in fact, the congressman from New Orleans who was on the subcommittee, Towson, actually inserted the pro-competition part of that act, and I helped his staff craft that. But that act did not do nearly as much as Blair thinks it did. It was a step in the right direction and did something, and was a policy statement. I'd be happy to talk to him about that, and he might convince me otherwise, but I'm pretty sure that that's right. What really is important here is that cable TV came into the market, was blocked for 15 years. Really, this starts under Newton Minow, who calls broadcasting a vast wasteland. Then he blocks cable from competing, carrying the water for the broadcasters. And for really to the late 70s, cable's kept out of the market. Then there's a deregulation that occurs under Ford and Carter. Cable comes in, wires the country. Now, cable instantly has a monopoly problem almost because of the franchise, and that's when I came in and started looking at these monopolies that were issued by local governments. But the great thing is they were competing with broadcasting, so they brought that competition to the market. They brought many more stations, and I went back to just this week to read Three Blind Mice, 1991 by Ken Aletta. He says in 1976, the average American had 7 choices for channels. In the 1991, it was up to 33. And that's because cable's coming in. It's giving us choice. Of course, it's gone to an infinite number of channels now, if you will, with over the top. But that's because cable not only came in and provided that alternative, and satellite did come in and compete with cable and even expanded that space into hundreds of channels through rivalry between cable and satellite. And now, in the 2000s, we've had, and partly because of the '96 Telecommunications Act, we've had phone companies come in and compete now in the broadband space with cable. Cable was allowed to integrate right into the phone business through broadband, through data. There was no prohibition. There was no licensing. Okay, now, yeah, some interests, including phone companies and state governments, wanted there to be a license to get into the broadband business. But at any rate, we had an open market there. Cable came in, intermediate competition, intermodal competition with first broadcasting, then on the other side with telecommunications providers. And so cable busts that open. It's bringing in satellite competition for television. That's very important in the '90s and 2000s. Now satellite's sort of fading out that way. Why? Because cable has built its own successor by putting broadband, high capacity broadband in, and of course triggering this competition from the telephone companies. They're also obviously having to respond with broadband of their own. Now people are, in the Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu, Apple TV, you name it world. We're all over the top, and now it's thousands of channels. And this is from what, 1978 to 2020. The world has changed multiple times because we allowed some industries just to go into other industries and take their best shot with new technology. And that's really quite phenomenal.
Right, and so your take, my summary of your take is that cable comes in as an unlicensed, unregulated player, is able to shake things up in the video space and also the broadband space, and then kind of rolls right into broadband. Okay, so now let's look at the future here. What does this say to things like facilities-based competition? What does it say to how we're going to get to the next stage of broadband, where we have symmetrical capacity and are not so restricted as cable plants often are, good on downstream, not so good on upstream? And I'm going to throw one more question here too, Tom, because I know you love this question, is, so what does this say about net neutrality rules, right? And the whole fight that we've gotten into with every administration going back and forth on whether broadband is a Title I light regulation or no regulation, or Title II common carrier regulation. What does the future hold when you do have some players who come in a non-regulated fashion, while others maybe still exist in a regulatory world?
Right. Well, yeah, that's a lot. So just to answer where the next step is, I mean, we're already in the next step, and that's wireless, 5G. Certainly beyond that, we're going to be in a place where it's going to be probably increasingly difficult for the fixed systems, the wireline systems, to compete with wireless. That's just where we're going. Now, on top of wireless, we've got a form of wireless, satellite, invigorated through technological advance to a point where we've really never seen the satellite industry be on the cutting edge the way it is right now. Now, you say, well, how many people subscribe to broadband satellite? And it's a small number. So this is a prediction, but there's a lot of excitement, a lot of investment. Not just SpaceX, but multiple competitors in that space to launch constellations of low Earth orbit satellites that do not have the latency issues of the geosynchronous orbits that are high in the sky. And it's very exciting what's happening in the next step for wireless, when you go a little higher than terrestrial. So yeah, on the net neutrality question, I've written quite a bit about this and done some of the empirical studies that were able to focus early on when we had differential regulation between the telecommunications carriers and cable TV carriers, cable being unregulated with respect to the cable modem service. The telecommunications operators in the early 2000s were fairly tightly regulated in how they had to provide what was called open access to competitors that would like to give internet access service to retail customers. And there's just no question the cable was a much more aggressive entrant into that market and did very well. And then, in fact, then telephone companies were then deregulated to basically give them the openness or a liberal environment of cable, and then they spurted and came alive. The technology gods seem to be favoring cable over time now, and in 2020, there's some parts. I live in one of the parts of the country where a phone company called AT&T is essentially given up, and Charter Communications provides a couple hundred megabits per second, very high speed service here in a fairly rural area, we've seen this market just change phenomenally, as I say, over the last couple of decades. But that has been a product of allowing that competition, and it has not been a product of neutrality. And in fact, the FCC has tried at least 3 times with net neutrality orders that have come and gone. Either due to, in 2 cases, being overturned by federal courts, and then in 1 case being overturned by change of administration, with a surprise election in 2016. And we may be headed for another oscillation, depending upon the results of this November 2016. But it's fairly clear that net neutrality as an actual policy is is really not a serious policy. That is to say, even under the most Title II, the most severe restrictions in 2016 that were upheld in June of 2016 by a federal appeals court, even under those restrictions, it was perfectly legal, according to the FCC, for T-Mobile to have a binge-on policy where they gave you special access to broadband services that agreed to cooperate with T-Mobile and provide, to cooperate with their bandwidth requirements and so forth. And that certainly gave those technologies a heads up over competing broadband content competitors. And so this idea that the platform should be neutral and should allow anything to come in and not be a managed space that must be regulated and determine what's appropriate to manage by regulators. I don't even take the U.S. regulators seriously when they say that that's really what they're after. It would be disastrous to eliminate the great amount of network management that's in the system now. And the way you want to do it, obviously, is to have intense competition among the players. You say there aren't many players. That's the argument. Well, that's right. This is not going to be a market with 20 or 30 local networks, but we do have opportunities to create more cable versus telco versus satellite versus terrestrial wireless. We certainly have taken some of those options, and rightfully so, and we should take more. And I think that we've been headed in the right direction. The internet has not broken under the strains and extra demands of the pandemic. We haven't had to ask Netflix to go standard definition rather than high definition, which they have had to do in Europe. And I think we're coping with the current situation pretty well. But more importantly, we're building for the future, and the incentives that are in place have done pretty well on that.
We have a quick question here on ATSC3. If you could explain what that is and this take here on monetizing viewers like over the top.
Yeah, I'd be happy to hear your discussion. I don't want to offer an expert opinion on that. I mean, I'm skeptical that broadcasting is going to come back in the game, but if that can be loosened up, I'm certainly in favor of broadcasters having the ability to adapt to the new technology and provide OTT-like services and to take a shot at it. I'm certainly in favor of that.
Well, I want to come back. Perhaps this will be our last topic to this notion of the fairness doctrine, particularly in light of recent developments in the Trump administration and in attacks on Section 230. The GOP has long claimed that it's opposed to the fairness doctrine. It's even in its 2016 platform that it wants to eliminate the fairness doctrine, which has been eliminated. And yet the attacks are of a fairness doctrine piece, right? Google, Twitter, Facebook are biased against us, and they need to be neutral. So Tom, what's your take on the Trump administration's approach to Section 230?
Yeah, well, I'm I'd say pretty much on the other side. There are some questions about how much we want to give firms let them off the hook on various liabilities that are long-standing in common law. But the fact is that this, as you suggest, this is an attack on the content of certain operators, and I'm sympathetic to many of the criticisms. But the way to address that is not to go to a fairness doctrine regime, which is exactly what's being suggested. That is to say that regulations will be applied based upon the content or mix of perspectives presented by the firms, and that has provided a very problematic outcome, to put it mildly. Chilling effect has been shown, and it is unconstitutional after all. The government's not supposed to. Congress will make no law abridging freedom of speech or of the press. Platforms have fundamental rights to shape content. One of the things that I notice about this, it's quite fascinating, is that just a few years ago, the unanimous chorus from the tech community was that every platform had to be wide open and no curation, was a right-wing conspiracy to have any kind of curation. Everything had to be anybody gets to say anything. Now that viewpoint is completely shifted. That Trump tweets should be regulated by the platform. The platform should have a lot to say about what goes on and not give an audience to those who are antisocial. On the other hand, the conservatives, they, as you say, have the fairness doctrine abolition in their 2016 platform. Now they're very much for regulation. Newt Gingrich has been talking about public utility regulation since, I think, the moment it was announced that Trump had won the 2016 election, and he has been out there with that. Now, it is interesting. Gingrich might be the one to actually assert consistency, because he was opposed to the abolition of the fairness doctrine way back in the day, as were some Jesse Helms and some noted conservatives. In general, Reagan was the guy who really, as president, vetoed the legislation from Congress that conservatives, many prominent conservatives, voted for to overrule the FCC on the fairness doctrine abolition way back in '87. So conservatives have been they switch, and of course the left switches as well. This is one of the problems with something like content regulation. I mean, you're just going to get the political equilibrium. You're not going to get actual science or objectivity being administered.
Well, one more sign-off question, Professor Hazlett. Tell us just a little bit about the Information Economy Project at Clemson University and what you're looking to next. What are the big crystal ball things you're researching or on your horizon as a kind of a last thoughts for us here today?
Well, we try to combine it's sort of the intersection between law and economics, which is discipline in academia, and telecommunications policy, or as it's called today, information policy. And there are so many, we've been covering many things from net neutrality to spectrum policy, but obviously what we just talked about here, regulating the big platforms today, privacy rights, antitrust, free speech. These are great issues. They've followed America through a lot of its history, and certainly its current challenges. I think the platforms are great. I think the technologies are great, but every revolution in the economy, and particularly in communications, brings its own very severe challenges. And I do not ridicule the idea that we do have important changes in society that will inspire people to think about if better rules, different rules, should be put in place. And so those are debates that we have in every generation, and certainly for every revolution. And what we've done in recent years has been just amazing enough, so that I'm not surprised we're having these debates. I hope people keep their heads and obviously are learn the most they can, or as respectful as possible of the people who disagree. But there's no question we're going to have charged debates now and in the years to come.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for being with us, and thank you to our audience for watching. We'll be back again next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time for another Broadband Breakfast Live Online, Champions of Broadband. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you.